Let's make up an imaginary field of study and call it boulder rollology. Imagine it consists of scientists trying to explain the acceleration with which boulders roll down hills. Different boulders, of course, are measured as rolling with different accelerations. And suspend your disbelief, imagine everyone really wants to know why. Some of the scientists look at the size of the boulders. Some of them look at the local temperature or air pressure. Some of them look at the ways boulders are formed. Others distract themselves with the history of boulders, which doesn't really help the quest much, but is still quite interesting as a means of hypothesis generation. Some of them look at how round the boulders are. Some look at humidity. Others look at altitude. And these boulder rollologists, they find correlations, they take their low p-values, and they give TED Talks and get book deals and give advice and make generalizations, and though sometimes for individual boulders, their findings matter a lot, overall, none of their subfields and pet theories are able to consistently explain that much of the variance in boulder acceleration. This is kind of how a lot of psychology feels right now. We have scientists trying to explain differences in human behavior with all sorts of variables, right? Are they a man or a woman? Did they have a stay-at-home mom? Did they go to a private school or a public school or a charter school? Were they homeschooled? Were they breastfed? Did they play violent video games? Does their area have high income inequality? Did they have two dads? What type of diet did their parents raise them on? And all of these things, right, they might matter for how the boulder of the human mind rolls, right? All of them could be really important, especially in individual cases. But when looking at the big picture, none of them matter that much. None of these explain that much variance in human psychology. Most of the boulder rollologists are ignoring the slope of the hill. Most psychologists are ignoring genes. Your DNA coded for the proteins and regulatory molecules that made and run your brain and all its related systems. And so, it shouldn't surprise you to learn that DNA affects your mind and the decisions it makes. And if this does shock you, well, what did you think your brain was doing? But while DNA explaining some of the variance in human behavior shouldn't surprise you, I think this next fact will. Just as the slope of a hill is typically the most important determinant of the acceleration of a boulder, whenever you try to study the psychological variance of any given population at any given time, typically, DNA comes out to be more important than what school a person went to, more important than who raised them, more important than how they raised them, more important than the gender they were born with, and more important than everything else on top of that. Now, today's guest was initially somewhat hesitant about coming on this platform, only because his expertise is not on the evolutionary side of things, which many episodes of Species tend to touch on. But since DNA and human behavior are such common stars on this show, and given the recent stir some of my videos on behavioral genetics have caused, I figured it would be worthwhile to have on one of history's greatest behavioral geneticists, Dr. Robert Plomin. Professor Plomin was a pioneer in the field of twin studies. His work has been cited over 130,000 times. He has received more awards and honors than it would be practicable for me to name here, and he is widely acknowledged to be one of the most important psychologists. Well, no qualification is needed there. He's just one of the most important psychologists, period. His book, Blueprint, has shifted my worldview more than any other book I've read this year, and I've put the link in the show description for you to buy it. You guys know I'm not a salesman, I'm just saying, this book is awesome. Merry Christmas to all who celebrate. Thank you to the donors who make this show possible. If you want to send the podcast a Christmas present, you can go to macandmurphy.org, scroll down, and click Donate near the Species logo. Buckle up, you're about to learn a lot about the biggest influence on your behavior from the person who knows it best. Enjoy. What is a twin study? What is an adoption study? And how can either of them clue us in to the impact of genetics on behavior?
Let's start with the adoption study because it's more direct. It's a social experiment in which we separate nature and nurture, which usually go together in families, parents and offspring or siblings. you're 50% similar genetically to your biological first-degree relatives. But when you find that things run in families, like schizophrenia, for example, for a century, people have assumed that that's nurture. It's due to environmental transmission from parents to offspring. And that's a reasonable assumption. But the adoption study tests the extent to which it's nature or nurture by studying nature parents, that is, genetic parents, biological parents, and their adopted away children. So they share genes with those children, they just don't share family environment. And the converse of that then tests the direct influence of nurture, because you've got adoptive parents who adopt kids early in life, but they don't share genes with those kids. And the clearest example is for body weight. People are often surprised to find that body mass index, weight corrected for height, the heritability is about 70%. And that means that in the populations that we've studied with their mix of genetic and environmental influences, the inherited DNA differences account for about 70% of the differences between people in body mass index. And adoption designs show that, because you find that parents and offspring correlate for body mass index about 0.4. Now, they're 50% related genetically, but they correlate about 0.4, when correlation goes from 0 to 1. So to what extent is that nature or nurture? And it's always been assumed, and it's a reasonable assumption, that that's due to nurture. Parents give kids their food, let alone diets and lifestyles. But what about biological parents, birth parents, who relinquish their kids for adoption at birth? They're 50% similar to their adopted away kids. What's their correlation in body mass index? And the amazing answer is 0.4. They correlate just as much with their kids' body weight as do parents who rear their kids. Then the other side of it is, what about adoptive parents? They raise their kids, but they're not genetically related. They correlate 0 for body mass index.
Wow.
And then similarly with the twin studies, you find that identical twins correlate about 0.7 something for body mass index, and fraternal twins correlate about I think it's 0.35 or so. And you can look at the difference in those correlations and estimate heritability as about 70%. If it was 100%, you'd expect identical twins to be correlating 1, that is 100% similar, and fraternal twins to correlate 0.5. Instead, here we have like 0.75 and 0.4 something, 0.35. So it's a big difference, and it's about twice the difference between MZ and DZs, which is exactly what their genetic difference and similarity is. That is, identical twins are 100% similar, and fraternal twins are 50% similar. So anyway, the twin design then, with its very different assumptions, comes up with much the same conclusion. And now we're finding from DNA studies, where you can study large samples of unrelated individuals, from DNA that we can actually measure, we can estimate heritability as about 50%. And we're not measuring all the DNA differences. So we're only measuring some of them, and yet we can still come up with an estimate of something like 50%. And you can argue with twin studies and adoption studies, but you just can't argue with DNA.
Yeah, I think there are 3 things that need to be emphasized here. First is that the methodology that you just described has found heritability not just for obesity, but for a whole suite of psychological characteristics, from, as you say, schizophrenia to divorce to obesity to your probability of enjoying reading books to all sorts of things. The second thing would be that this multiple sites of evidence method, where we're looking at twin studies, adoption studies, and then, as you say, DNA studies, all of it triangulating on the same loose results for these traits, makes it really hard for someone to make a counter argument that doesn't acknowledge the role of genetics and behavior. And then the third thing is the thing that we keep mentioning here, which is heritability. And you did a good job to explain it, but because the percentages and the use of percentages often confuses people, what exactly is heritability? Like, when you say obesity is 70% heritable, what exactly is meant by that? Does that, because some people will hear that and think that, oh, my 70% of my obesity was caused by genes and 30% of my obesity was caused by me. Or they'll think there's a 70% probability of them being obese if their parents were obese or something like that.
No, that's exactly the misunderstanding that people make, that one exactly. But before I get to explaining heritability, let me just say about your first point, it's not just the few things I mentioned that are heritable. It's everything is heritable. So when I was in graduate school 50 years ago in the 1970s, most psychologists didn't even think of the possibility of genetic influence. And it was dangerous to even mention it because it was just, in psychology was what we call environmentalistic. It was assumed from Freud onwards that everything about us is what we learned. It's due to the environment. Genetics never even crossed anybody's mind. And there were people who said at the time, there's a famous quote saying there's no evidence that would lead a prudent man to think that anything shows any heritability. And we've gone in about 20, 30 years from realizing it's just the opposite. There's nothing that's not heritable. Every trait that's been studied in a reasonably powerful study, where the sample size is large enough to be able to detect these effects, shows significant, and not just significant, but substantial genetic influence. There was a famous meta-analysis of 15,000 studies, not just of behavioral traits, but also in medicine, physiology. And on average, all traits, that is, individual differences between people, all traits show about 50% heritability. That isn't 100%. That's an important point to make. But in the behavioral sciences, people often don't understand that it's very rare to explain 5% of the variance. So you hear a lot about sex differences between boys and girls. Girls are good at verbal, boys are good at math. Well, how much of the variance, that is, of the differences between kids, is explained by sex, by gender? And the answer is 1%. So that means, these are normal distributions, right, of verbal ability and math ability and height and weight and everything we're talking about. And if you try to draw the distribution for girls and boys, you need a very fine pen to do it because they overlap 99 point something percent. And what it means, bottom line, is if all you know about a kid is whether they're a boy or a girl, you don't know anything about their verbal and math ability. Yet, there are books and books written about this. People think, girls are from Venus and boys are from Mars, and, they think there's these huge mean differences. So it's really, one issue here is that psychology has been hung up on statistical significance. And there's a lot of people who feel that's been misleading. It's led to the replication crisis, which has been a huge issue in science. And I won't go into that too much. I don't know if you've covered that at all, but it's a very important topic. And part of that's due to the fact that people are chasing these, we call them p-values, significance levels, and they just report things that are significant, and they make it look like they had thought that was their hypothesis. So the thing about behavioral genetics is we focus much more on effect size. And this is one little pitch I'd like to give to your audience. When people say something is significantly related to something else, or there's an effect that they're talking about, like in the papers, parents do this and kids are like that. Just always ask, what's the effect size? How big of an effect is it? Not just is it statistically significant? Because the point about statistical significance, like the difference between boys and girls in verbal and math ability, is that with a large enough sample, and these samples of gender differences are huge, because you can study tens of thousands of boys and girls, large samples make very tiny differences, statistically significant.
Yep.
So the effect size means you got to ask, yeah, okay, it's statistically significant. That's just the starting point, though. The real issue is how important is it? How socially significant is it? And so if people would just always ask, yeah, but what's the effect size? That will stop people in their tracks and make them appreciate genetics, because explaining 50% of the variance of the differences between people on average across most traits, it's just off the scale. There's been nothing close to this in the behavioral sciences. So it is a big deal, but it's also important that it's 50%, not 100%.
Yeah, I guess I'll just jump in to say that I think a huge part, and I'm not the first to observe this, a huge part of what's misleading about statistical significance is actually just the choice of the word significant, because popular press outlets will say, let's use your example, that being a girl is significantly associated with increased verbal processing ability, let's say. And so people will read that and you say, oh, it's significant, as in it has a significant impact. But then you actually look at their data, and this is true with so many findings. You actually look at their data and it's statistically significant, but practically it's completely insignificant. It's almost uninformative. And in the case that you chose, it is uninformative. Again, if you go into a classroom and you have to guess whether a student is, top of their class in reading, knowing whether they're a boy or a girl isn't particularly informative. But I do want to circle back to heritability, because I am concerned that, again, even with talking about effect sizes, that people will think that, oh, because my parents got divorced and divorce is 40% heritable, I now have a 40% chance of divorce or something else like that. I think there's like 7 different ways that you can get confused about what heritability means. And I would love for you to just drive home exactly what it is and what we mean by that.
Well, that's good. I'm glad to have an opportunity to do it. In my book, Blueprint, this is in the first few pages. And as I mentioned before, it is one of the most misunderstood concepts. It's not confusing, it's precise. It means something precisely, but it's very hard to bring in all the background to get people to understand it. So the first point is one I alluded to before, that it refers to individual differences, why people differ at the individual level, why some people are heavier than others. And what these techniques do is they allow us to disentangle the effects of genetics and environment on those individual differences. But it's specific to the particular population that you study at the particular time. Genetic and environmental influences can certainly change secularly across time for people. It can differ in different populations. Heritability is a descriptive statistic. And like other descriptive statistics like means and variances, a good descriptive statistic changes when the population changes because it's describing that population. So it's limited to the populations we're studying at a particular time. And furthermore, it's about the average differences in the populations we study. It's not talking about one individual, like your example, like with height, if it's height is about 80% heritable, but that means if you're 6'4" like me, it doesn't mean I got 6 inches from my genes and the other 4 from the environment, which sounds silly, but really when you dig down a bit in terms of what people think about with genetic influences and heritability, as you said, that's the way they're thinking about me as one individual. But I hope people can see saying that 80% of my height is due to genes and the other 4 inches is due to the environment. That's wrong. It's not what we're saying. And it's very different from saying of the differences between me and all these other people, all of our differences, about 80% of those differences in this population we studied are due to inherited DNA differences. And the other aspect to this is we're describing what is rather than what could be. So a trait we could study a population and the trait could be highly heritable, and yet it could change immediately. And some people used as an example dentistry and decay and that sort of thing. And with preventive dentistry, you could take a trait. Decay is quite substantially heritable. It has to do with salinity, acidity ratios in your mouth and lots of things. But there is genetic influence on the extent to which you have tooth decay. And yet, if you could institute a new environmental regime that wasn't represented previously, like preventive dentistry, flossing, staining your teeth, that sort of thing, you could take this heritable trait and eliminate it. So we're describing what is in a particular population at a particular time, not what could be or what is in other populations. So it's a descriptive statistic. And the one other bit to this, there's half a dozen other of these things I could go into, but the other one that I find is important in talking to people is we're studying a particular population. And we don't study everybody in a population. We try to have representative samples, maybe representing 95% of the population. But in terms of studies of kids, which I do, for example, we're certainly underrepresented by neglect and abuse. Parents who are like that don't tend to participate in studies, for example. And we actually find we have more of a deficit at the super high end. We don't have the super rich people. We talk about them as too posh to play, you know?
Right.
It could be a highly heritable trait, but that's not to say that abuse and neglect could not have an effect. You'd almost bet they do. I mean, height, you lock a kid in a closet and don't give them proper nutrition, and they definitely won't grow to their normal height. So it's what is versus what could be. And I think I touched on most of the essential confusions about heritability. But just to circle back to what you started with, it's not about you as one individual. It's about differences between people in the population.
That did an immense amount of work, I think, for everybody in terms of bringing heritability and the common confusions around it into focus. I think another area of potential confusion that's outside of heritability is just a lot of people are going to hear you say that genes have an influence on everything behavioral, and they're going to draw the conclusion, I think, because as you say in your book, it's because they learned Mendelian genetics in high school. They're going to assume that there is one gene or a few genes, quote unquote, for obesity or for height or for schizophrenia or for infidelity or whatever is under the impact of genetics. What's wrong with that assumption?
People, as you say, they learn about genetics from Mendel, and Mendel was studying single gene disorders in pea plants. I mean, if you're a pea plant, you like your seeds to be nice and smooth. And if you have a certain mutation, your seeds will be wrinkled. And it's a single gene in the sense that it's necessary and sufficient. So if you happen to inherit that mutation, your seeds will be wrinkled. And you'll only have wrinkled seeds if you inherit that mutation. So necessary and sufficient. And so that's the way people think about genetics, because it's easy. You know, you either have it or you don't. Turns out it's a little more complicated when you get into recessive traits. Like most disorders have recessive mutations where you need 2 copies of it. So that if you only have 1 copy, you're a carrier, but you don't actually show the disorder. So it gets a little more complicated. But there are, some people say 7,000, there are thousands of these single gene disorders in parents and in people. And you might, some of the more common ones are phenylketonuria, PKU, which is the single gene recessive disorder that causes severe intellectual disability. And Huntington's disease, which is something that Woody Guthrie died from, it's a dominant single gene mutation. These are necessary and sufficient. If you got the gene for Huntington's, and Arlo Guthrie, the son of Woody, has a 50% chance of having that gene, then if you got that mutation, you will die from Huntington's. It's a neurodegeneration thing that you gradually lose function over 10, 15 years, but it will kill you unless something else kills you first. There's no amount of exercise or nutrition or anything that will prevent that from happening. And so that's where you get this deterministic view of genes, you know, that they're hardwired. There's nothing you can do about it. And in fact, with single gene disorders, that's pretty true. With PKU, it's interesting. We were able to understand what the mutation does, and that is it disrupts metabolism of phenylalanine, and then that builds up in the baby's brain, and it causes severe disruption. So the simple way of sidestepping that bullet is if you find out, and you can predict at birth, and this is what all countries do. They do testing for PKU at birth. That's that Guthrie test, the heel prick. They measure a few of these single gene disorders, because if you knew the baby had 2 doses of that mutation for PKU, all you have to do is cut down on phenylalanine in the diet. And that's particularly in mother's breast milk, as well as in red meats and some sorts of dairy products. And so by cutting down the phenylalanine, you don't have a lot of it sitting around in the developing brain. And by the time kids are in late childhood or so, it's okay, because the brain has developed sufficiently that it's not so much of a problem anymore. So in general, it's right, when people think about genes as hardwired and deterministic, and these single gene disorders are a big deal, but they're very rare. They're not a major source of genetic influence in the population for the sorts of common disorders that we study and traits. And that's where the big change happens. And this goes back to the beginning of genetics in the 1900s. Mendel did his work in the mid-1800s, and his manuscripts, nobody paid any attention to it, and it was rediscovered in about 1903. And when geneticists found that, they went around looking for these segregation ratios that Mendel's work is all about, based on the idea that you either have this form of the gene or not, and it's a single gene sort of thing. On the other hand, Galton, who is Darwin's cousin, started the other area of genetics called quantitative genetics, which is the sort of genetics I do. And they assumed that whatever Mendel was on about, it was something peculiar to the pea plant, because they knew with important human characteristics, it's never either or. It's not that you either have this disorder or you don't. Everything that's important in agriculture, animal husbandry, and in humans is quantitative. It's a matter of more or less, not either or. And so they just ignored Mendel's stuff for a while. But then in 1918, there was this famous paper by R.A. Fisher who brought the two together and said, if you just assume that there's several genes operating the way Mendel said they worked, if several genes affect a trait, it will lead very quickly to a normal distribution, a quantitative trait. With DNA now, we've really shown that Fisher was right. It's even more extreme than he thought. That with these new DNA studies where we can find the DNA differences that make a difference in behavior, for traits like common disorders or the traits we were talking about in psychology, there's never an effect of one gene, a big effect of one gene. The biggest effects are incredibly small. And what that means is that heritability is due to not just 1 or 10 or 100 or 1,000, but thousands of tiny DNA differences. And that's really important conceptually because it moves this from deterministic to probabilistic. It does so even if there's just a few genes involved. But the important thing to recognize is when we say there's genetic influence on a trait, we're not talking about one gene. And it's our ongoing battle with people who write headlines in the newspapers. The guys who do the headlines are different from the ones who write the articles. And you talk to this journalist and you say, now make sure you don't talk about this as the gene for. There's many genes involved. This is probabilistic, not deterministic, not hardwired. And then the headline comes out, the gene for has been found, So this is a really important point that you raise. And so the thing for people to hang on to, we're not talking about hardwired determinism of a single gene. We're talking about the probabilistic influence of many, many genes of small effect.
I guess to clear up a kind of sub-confusion as well in this same area, you'll hear people say things like, balding comes from your mother's father, or that depression skips a generation, or whatever. Those ideas are misled or wrong.
Yeah. There are 23 pairs of chromosomes, and one pair is called the sex chromosome, where women have two X's, two X chromosomes, one from each parent, and boys have one X chromosome from their mother, but they get from their father the Y chromosome. So they're XY. And genes that are on the X chromosome do show some effects of the sort you're talking about. But that's for single gene disorders again. And so when you talk about complex traits like we do that are influenced by many genes, you're absolutely right. That's nothing to consider. I mean, it's not an important phenomenon.
Interesting. I've got a couple more areas of confusion here, but they're all very interesting to clear up. I definitely don't feel like we're doing a chore here. You talk about traits like watching TV or a propensity to watch TV being inherited. And my audience is really quite literate in evolutionary biology, and I'm worried that many of them are going to view genes only through that lens. Why and how would genetics, which are the result of selection, that except for the last few generations had not been exposed to television at all, why would genetic variation between individuals exist that impacts a person's probability of whether they like watching TV?
Another great question. And it touches on the difference between evolutionary approaches to genetics and the sort of genetics I'm talking about. Because evolutionary genetics is about sort of at the species level. We call it normative in a way. Why does one species do this and another species do that? Whereas what we're talking about is individual differences within a species, and there's no necessary relationship between them. So a trait could be highly adaptive and yet show no heritability. For example, you could take bipedalism or binocular vision. At a certain level, you could say almost all humans walk on two legs and have 3D vision because their eyes are in the front of their head. And so if there's no variability, that is, if something's so important evolutionarily that there is no variability, then heritability is a meaningless concept because there aren't any individual differences. Now, however, you can actually look at it more precisely if you're not just comparing one species to another, but say you're particularly interested in this species, the human species, and you start to say, well, are we all the same in bipedalism and in three-dimensional vision? And the answer is no. Obviously, some people have much greater visual acuity than others. And when you measure bipedalism, if you measure it functionally, like walking or running, obviously there's huge differences between people. And when you study those differences, you can ask the extent to which genetic and environmental factors are important. And in those cases, you do find that there's strong genetic influence. Individual differences in inherited DNA make a difference in your gait and how fast you run, for example, and in the acuity of your vision. But there are some examples where what's evolutionarily important, it's hard to find examples where there isn't much heritability because everything's heritable. But one area of evolutionary psychology relevant to development is attachment. And we're called mammals because of mammary glands and the fact that children need caretakers because they're not able to take care of themselves early on. And so you might think then, well, if attachment has been channeled by evolution in mammalian species, that the kids are attached to their caregiver, and they get upset if they wander away from their caregiver, that all makes sense in an adaptive evolutionary sense. But it doesn't mean that individual differences in attachment have to be heritable. And in fact, the early studies suggested that there was very little genetic influence on individual differences in dyadic attachment. That is, some mothers and infants are very closely attached. Babies get very upset if they're separated from their mother. And others, are much less tightly attached. And some early studies suggested that wasn't very heritable. Some more recent studies suggest that there is some heritability. But the point I'm trying to make is there's no necessary connection between group differences, like species differences, and individual differences within a species. It's a very important point, and it reminds me that there's another dimension to this that I should mention now, and that is that of the 3 billion base pairs of DNA, I'm sure your audience knows, the spiral staircase of DNA, and there's these nucleotide bases that are like steps in the spiral staircase. So there's some 3 billion of those in your DNA. 99 point something, some people say 0.9% of those steps are all the same for all of us. We don't have any DNA differences. And that's what makes us human. Those are things that evolved and they don't have variation because they're so important, possibly. But we're studying in the quantitative genetics, we're asking the extent to which those DNA differences that exist, and even if it's only 0.1%, that's still millions of DNA differences. To what extent do those differences in inherited DNA variation make a difference in the traits we study?
I guess since we're already here, it would probably be useful to be even more precise and clear up a related confusion where many people will hear something like, oh, alcoholism, variance in alcoholism within this population at this time was X% heritable.
Mm-hmm.
And then they'll take that finding, walk away with it. And then later, when they see something like I'm Irish or my ancestry on both sides, very recent ancestry is all Irish, they might see that, oh, Irish people have a higher rate of alcoholism on average, and kind of pair those two things and say, oh, that must be because Irish people have certain genetics that predispose them to it. But that leap is not necessarily true, right? Like the findings from individual differences in genomics actually don't have much relevance to someone who might be interested in group differences in behavior.
Yeah, both ways around. Again, it's an example of mean differences between groups. And I don't even know if it's true that on average, Irish drink more than, say, English.
Yeah, I would actually be surprised if it was true, having lived in England for a bit now.
Yeah. But if there is a difference, you want to ask, what's the effect size? How much variance does it explain? But it doesn't, it's hard to prove genetic influence on group differences because it's like 1 degree of freedom. We don't have any killer techniques that allow us to say that an average difference between two groups, like alcohol differences use in English and Irish, is genetic or not. But whether it is or not, that has no bearing on whether individual differences within either population are due to genetic differences. So it's good to bring that up again. And also, the other thing I find we haven't mentioned yet about misconceptions is that you say something's genetic and people say, right, well, there's nothing you can do about it. And alcoholism's a good example. If you knew you were at strong genetic risk for alcoholism, you cannot become alcoholic if you don't drink a lot of alcohol over a long period of time. And so that's where it would be very useful to be able to find these genes and to tell people about their genetic risk for alcoholism, because it doesn't mean you're determined to become alcoholic. It just means, other things being equal, you're more likely to become alcoholic drinking the same amount of alcohol that some of your friends than their probability of becoming alcoholic. It's not fatalism. It just means that you might pay more attention to the warnings we all get about, pay attention to how much alcohol you're drinking, take holidays from alcohol to see how dependent you are, that sort of thing. So I think alcoholism is a good example of that. But I guess the major point you were making is between average differences between groups. And what I want to say is that that doesn't relate to the causes of individual differences within groups. And in my book, I say I don't talk about that because we don't have good techniques to analyze the causes of differences, average differences between groups. But we have very powerful techniques for analyzing individual differences within groups. And if you ask about effect size, often the average differences between groups are not that great. They don't account for much variance. They're no big deal anyway, except that we like to think about stereotyping people, but that's all wrong, really. The third reason I give as to why I don't study average differences between groups is because I don't have to study everything. And I'd rather go with the tractable problem of understanding individual differences within groups.
Thank you for clarifying all of that. I think that's very useful. And I'm also really glad that you brought up that knowing that you have a genetic propensity for something can actually be quite empowering and useful as opposed to fatalistic. I mean, I have a relative who found out through one of those personal genomics things that they have a relatively high genetic susceptibility to, I think, Alzheimer's dementia. You could take two approaches to that, right? You could take this fatalistic idea, which is wrong, and think, oh, I'm susceptible to it, so, I'm going to take up boxing, I'm going to drink tons of alcohol, I'm not going to worry about it because I'm going to get it anyway. But that's completely misled. It's actually much better, and this is what my relative has done, is to see, oh my gosh, I have a genetic propensity. I better see what I can do now to kind of compensate for that and fight back a little bit. Like, okay, I should cut down on alcohol. I should, take my omega-3 supplements. I should engage myself in cognitively stimulating tasks. All those things, get enough sleep, all the things that you can do to reduce your probability. I think that knowing that you have a genetic susceptibility or at the very least a family history, which can be a vague proxy for that, a family history of a disorder or a deleterious trait, can actually be very helpful and empowering.
Yeah. Well, Alzheimer's is one of the more difficult issues, because you mentioned these direct-to-consumer DNA testing companies. And although Alzheimer's is, like other traits, moderately heritable and due to many genes a small effect, that is a counterexample of a disorder that has one gene, well, a couple of genes really, but one gene in particular that has a pretty big effect. And with these companies, this is something that's been known since the 80s and 90s. So this is a widely used sort of DNA variant. It's called apolipoprotein. It's the 4 allele, they call it. And if you have that allele, it's recessive. But if you get a double dose of that allele, one from your mother, one from your father, instead of having the, say, 10, 15% risk of having Alzheimer's in your 80s, you'd have something like a 60% chance. Now, that's only 1% of the population, but if people do 23andMe testing, and they will find this out. But there's a triple lock. You have to say, yes, I want to know, and you say, yes, I've read this material you gave me, and yes, I still want to know. But in the end, you get that information. And, if you're that 1% of the population with a double dose of that recessive allele, in medical terms, a 60% risk is astronomical compared to, say, a 10 or 15% risk. It still isn't 100%, as you say. But I use that as an example, asking people, what do you think about this? I mean, would you want to know or not? And in a public audience, I find it almost splits down the middle. Half of the people don't want to know. They say, well, why should I? There's nothing much I can do about it. Despite what you said, nothing that will absolutely prevent you from getting Alzheimer's. And you ask the other people, the group I'm in, and they'd say, well, knowledge is power, forewarned is forearmed. I want to know about stuff. And I would go further to say, even though there's no cure now, there could be, especially now that we know about this gene and a lot about how it works. And there's been some recent interesting results coming out. But I would say, even without that, if I knew I had that 60% risk, I'd do a bit more carpe diem. I'd realize it doesn't mean I'm going to be demented, have Alzheimer's when I'm older, but that chance is substantial enough for me. I'm going to make sure I live my life well now, and I'm going to set myself up for the possibility I'm going to need care when I'm older. And, in England especially, you can't rely on the state for that. You need to have a social network of friends who would be willing to take that on, or if you can do it financially, to assure that you would be taken care of. So I think there are things that you could know about it. And that's a particularly tough example because people don't want to talk about dying, but I think we actually need to have many more discussions about the fact that we all are going to die. It's the one sure thing. But a simpler example of this point you're making is that my highest, we call it polygenic score. These are scores that are aggregated from all the risk alleles or forms of a gene for a particular trait, like body mass index. And in my book, I present the world's first profile of these polygenic scores for like schizophrenia and depression and educational achievement and body mass index and height. Well, for height, I'm very high, 98th percentile genetically. And I happen to be at least that high phenotypically. My actual height is, say, 6'4.5" or something like that. But with weight, it's my highest risk score in a way. I'm at the 94th percentile genetically for body mass index, which means obesity, really. And, at the high end, it's what we call obesity. So to your point, well, what do you do about this? Does it mean I just throw up my hands and say, well, I'm a genetic fatty, I'm just going to eat, drink, and be merry because what can I do about it? But as you started out by saying, I actually think, and for me it's certainly true, that it's actually very positive because I realize I'm in a lifelong battle of the bulge. I've got it's a constant battle with weight. I weigh myself most every day, and I have a red line of 250 pounds where if I hit that, I've just got to pull out all the stops, stop drinking alcohol, really get my weight down because it's very invidious, as everybody knows who has a weight problem, that it's not like you just suddenly get fat. It's like 1 pound, 2 pounds, and you add these pounds slowly, but you don't get rid of them. And so people who are thin just don't get this. They think, well, just as they say in England, pull up your socks, have some willpower. But if anybody has any of these sorts of vulnerabilities, it's not just willpower. It's just, I know I just have to change my environment, because if I have crisp, potato chips in the house, something like that, I can resist it. But then sometimes, you're tired, you're not feeling well or whatever. You say, oh, I'm just going to watch some TV and I'll just have a chip or two. But then before you know it, the bag's gone. And so it is sort of willpower in a way, but it's easier for thin people to say that from people who, are there are psychological processes involved, like sensitivity to food cues. I used to bake bread. I cannot bake bread because I smell, even now, just talking about passing a bakery where you smell fresh bread and things being made, my mouth starts to water. I'm very sensitive to these food cues, which makes me a real sucker for the our fast food nation, where we're bombarded by food advertisements and that sort of thing, and then in addition, the other bit that's, I think, even more important for me is satiety. I don't know about your weight. You look very fit in your pictures. Maybe they're photoshopped, but it'd be probably hard for you to understand this. But if I'm out at dinner with people and we're having a nice conversation and they say, do you want any more? No, I'm fine. But then before you know it, all the food that's left on the table, I'm eating. Even though I'm not hungry by any means, but most normal people would say, no, I'm really full. If I eat any more, I'm going to be sick. And somehow that doesn't happen to me. I mean, I have to go pretty far down the line before that starts to kick in. So I think there are, real physiological reasons. There's lots of ways in which genetics can come in here. And of course, we're talking about thousands of tiny genetic effects that probably work all the way through personality and all levels of the brain. And, it's not like there's going to be some simple neurological pathway from one gene to body weight. So I think body weight is a good example of the general point you're making, that just because I have a very high genetic propensity towards putting on weight doesn't mean I'm destined to be fat. And everybody knows that, you can just work at it. But it takes more work on my part than it does on your part.
So one very surprising finding that you shared in your book that I think would be insanely controversial anywhere outside of a behavioral geneticist's office is that parenting has less of an impact on our psychology than our genes do. I think this is the second law of behavior genetics. And even when parenting seems to have an effect, genes are often the hidden culprit. One really persuasive and clarifying example for me was reading. I love to read. For what it's worth, your book, Blueprint, was a masterpiece. Great read. Really enjoyed it. But in any case, I always lay my love of reading at the feet of my parents, right? My parents used to read to me every night, even years after I could read to myself, actually, right? I'd spend the afternoon with a book and then look forward to the evening when one of my parents would read to me. I always assumed that this kind of heroic act of parenting is what accounted for my love of books. But now, after reading your book, I think probably not. While there is definitely a correlation between parents reading to kids and then kids liking reading, on your account, this is mostly not a causal relationship. If I understood correctly, it's more that the genes that make you more likely to read to your children are the same genes that make your children more likely to read. Could you explain what's happening here further?
Well, it's such a great example. Again, you're hitting all the hot topics, really. It's an example of correlation does not imply causation. But if you see a correlation between what parents do and how children become, like how much parents read to kids and how well they do at school, there's a lot more research on that rather than just liking to read. But there is some research on that backs up what you're saying. But that's just a correlation. For most correlations, I think your audience would know it doesn't imply causation. It could be that X causes Y. Parenting causes the kids to read better at school. But it could also be Y causes X. Kids who read, who like to read, who are interested in reading, their parents will respond to that and say, okay, yeah, I'll read to you. You get a lot of pleasure out of this. But then the third possibility, and this is where genetics really comes in, is that a third factor can account for both X and Y. And that third factor could be genetics. So there's reading is one of the more highly heritable traits. In fact, of all the cognitive abilities, the most heritable one is vocabulary, which is kind of neat in a way because people say, how can vocabulary be heritable? Because you don't inherit words. But obviously that isn't how the heritability works. It's just that I have one grandchild who always wants to know about nuances of words, even from when she was a little kid. Why do you say that? Why not this? What does this mean? She's interested in words. And I have several other grandchildren who, it's whatever, you know what I mean. It's like, I don't care. I mean, as long as you get my meaning here. And who's going to have the better vocabulary? It's the granddaughter who's tuned into this verbal channel. So I think that's the way genes work. So if genetics affects reading, it makes parents who read a lot, have a lot of books in the home, read to their kids, have kids who learn to read and like to read and read more, better at school. So you can always, there's no example you could come up with like that, a correlation between parenting and kids' outcomes that cannot be explained genetically. And when we do the research on this, and there's hundreds of studies now that have looked at the extent to which genetics mediates relationships between parenting and children's outcome. And the general finding is that about half of the correlations are due to genetic influence. So you can step back from that, though. And in the 80s, I did the first studies on environmental measures themselves, which is a bit like we were talking about with divorce. Now, you phrase divorce in terms of our likelihood, adults getting divorced. But, in the developmental literature, divorce is thought of as an environmental factor. Parents who get divorced have kids who are screwed up. So the story goes, which isn't true. And similarly, television viewing is viewed as an environmental phenomenon, that there's thousands of studies on the effects of television viewing on kids, and now the effects of screens and social media on kids. But any of these factors could show genetic influence, and they do when we study them. Environmental measures, on average, the ones that we widely use in psychology, like life events and social support and parenting, they all show genetic influence. Not 50% like behavioral traits, but more like 25%. But it's still very substantial, as I said, accounting for 25% of the differences, say, in life events. And again, as I started out talking about divorce, the same sort of thing. It's not that what we measure as life events are not environmental factors out there independent of us. What life events involves, and it really has been used in, I think someone said 5,000, 7,000 studies, it's things like financial disruption, having conflicts with people, losing your job. Divorce is also part of that. But these are not things out there that happen to us, capriciously. These are all things that we have something to do with, and that's where the genetics comes in. And once you start thinking this way, you realize there's really nothing that cannot show genetic influence. Every environmental measure. Like the classic example I like to use is, Samuel Clemens, Mark Twain said, everybody talks about the weather, nobody does anything about it. Well, people think, the weather, that's certainly something we can't do anything about. I mean, it's probably like a question on a psychotic thing, I can change the weather. But in fact, there's genetic influence on weather, certainly at the level of perception. And people say, well, that's just perception. I'm such an optimist. I always think back about the glorious summers I've had and that sort of thing. And other people say, are you nuts? That was the worst summer we've ever had, cold and rainy. But the point is, in a way, my perception of the weather is my experience.
It's not just perception. It's also where, like, if I was someone who hated that it's super dreary and rainy, I wouldn't have moved to England. Right?
Exactly
I
right.
mean,
No, that's the second point. It isn't just perceptions too. If you have seasonal affective disorder, you probably don't want to live in England.
right.
It's gloomy a lot of the time.
And it's funny because people often use findings like this to, I won't say often, but there are some people who use findings like this actually to mock behavior genetics. They'll
Exactly
say,
right.
well, look, I did this study and I found that this is X% heritable, and that's impossible. So clearly, twin and adoption studies, these are misleading, but they're actually just not thinking clearly enough. They're not thinking comprehensively enough because they're not realizing the point that you just said, which is personally my favorite insight from reading your book, which is something that I wasn't privy to before reading your book, which is that there's genes and there's environment, yes, and environmental impacts are significant, but many things that you would think of as an environmental impact are actually resultant of our genes, in the sense that I make decisions influenced by my genes that impact my environment, right?
Exactly.
And then on top of that, the other finding, which is that things that my parents, pleiotropy is the word for it, but the genes that cause my parents to parent me in this way might also happen to be the genes that cause me to behave in a certain way. And that's so abstract that it might be unclear. But back to the reading example, it's possible that the genes that caused my parents to just love reading to me just happen to be the same genes that caused me to love reading. And this will probably repeat the cycle in the next generation, where I'm going to really enjoy reading to my kids, and then they're going to go on to read as well. And I'll think that it's because I'm such a great parent, but it's probably just genetics. They probably would have read even if they were adopted by someone else.
There's another side to that's important, is you're only 50% similar genetically to your parents. So some people say,
right,
well,
yes.
How can that be? Because my parents read to me all the time, and I was terrible at reading. I had a lot of trouble with reading. But genetics predicts differences within families because you're 50% different from, say, your siblings. And it's a good example in my family. I learned to read early. I loved to read. My parents didn't go to university. We had no books, literally no books in our house. But in those days, there were public libraries, and I could go to the library even when I was 5 or 6 and bring back wagon loads of books. And so I created my own environment, I think correlated with my genetic propensity. I loved books and I loved to read, and as a result, I did well at school. In contrast, my sister was slow to read. She didn't like school because she didn't do well at school. It was hard for her. For me, it was just so easy. It isn't fair that I got credit for doing well at school and she got stick for it, like, got to try harder. Look at your brother, he's doing so well. But we got to realize genetics predicts differences within families. In contrast, though, nurture doesn't predict differences within families. A nurture hypothesis would say, well, your parents read a lot to you, and if you had siblings, they would have read a lot to them too. It would, because the parents are doing what they're doing. They're giving you your nurture. And yet that has great difficulty explaining why kids in the same family are so different. So yeah, and here's the thing is I don't know if this is completely true, but I know that people developmental psychologists who are really anti-genetics, and they just can't accept the possibility that there's genetic influence on kids' development, I find they don't have kids. And there's a famous saying, it's not just having one kid, because with one kid you can explain anything. That's the problem with environmental explanations. My kid's shy. Why? If you ask parents who have a shy kid, why is your kid shy? They give you one of two answers, invariably. I took her out too much when she was young, or I didn't take her out enough when she was young, which exposes what's wrong with environmental explanation. You don't want an explanation that can explain anything, because then it explains nothing. But then the thing is, this phrase is that parents are environmentalists until they have more than one child. Because when you have a second child and they're 50% different genetically, chances are if the first child was shy, the other one isn't going to be so shy. And you say, wait, I didn't do that. I mean, if I took her out a lot, well, I take the other one out a lot too. And there's, I don't know if you know this cult set of books in Norway by Karl Ove Knausgaard. It's called My Struggle. It's a 7,500 word series of books that I think 50% of the Norwegian population, they're really cult books all over the world. They're just great.
When you're saying these books are great, just not to be confused with another book by the same title.
Exactly. I don't know why he used the My Kampf
What was he
version.
thinking?
I don't know why he did that. But anyway, they're brilliant books because he's like Proust, minute detail about the Madeleine, but at a psychological level, like, 55 pages going to a birthday party with his daughter with a 4-year-old friend's birthday party. But what's brilliant is he has 3 kids, and his descriptions of those kids, he said he was a sociology type person, thought everything's environmental, and then he had the 3 kids, and he said you can't imagine 3 kids more different, from the get-go. And so he describes that beautifully. I think novelists often are better psychologists than psychologists.
Yes.
So
yeah, wow,
parents are
that's
environmentalists until they have more than one child. That's a good thing to hang on to, because when you see these kids, how different they are from early in life, you've got to realize that there's genetic influence and that your role as a parent is not overwhelming these differences between the kids. And furthermore, I'd say actually it suggests a different way of parenting. It's to recognize and respect these differences between kids and figure out what they like to do and what they're good at and help them do it. Rather than, the thing that bothers me about parenting books and stuff is that they all assume that parents have complete control over the way their kids turn out. And I say parents have very little control over how their kids turn out. They can make life nice for the kids, but they're not going to make them into what they want them to be unless they're choosing things that the kids have a propensity to do. Now, this is within the normal range, but I think parents would be much better served by figuring out what their kids like to do and helping them do it, rather than trying to mold their kid to be the way they want them to be. And, at the most ridiculous levels, if you wanted your kid to be an Olympic marathon runner, good luck to you if the kid doesn't have the body for it, for example. Same thing true with music, musical ability has a genetic component. Going back to this idea of we're describing what is rather than what could be. So music shows significant, not super high genetic influence, but say 40% heritability. Well, that doesn't mean you can't make a difference as a parent if you are a tiger mom, for example, and you make your kid do very well at music and practice and practice and practice. But I tried to do that with my sons, and they inherited orneriness from me, I think. And so I had this idea that you're not a civilized person unless you can read music. And so my standard was they're going to learn to play the piano to the point where they can, maybe not sight read, but they can at least read music. And they said, oh, right, that's what you want? I'm not going to do it. And it got to be a real battle. But in part, it's because they're smart and they realize they like music, but they're just not good at playing music. And they don't really enjoy that so much. Whereas they have friends without any music instructors. I'm shoving music instructors at them all the time. They're friends without any music lessons, are composing music. So it would be far better if, we look to see what kids like to do and help them become who they are, rather than trying to make them into who we want them to be, because that's a recipe for disaster in parenting.
I think that advice is very good, but one worry that I would have, and kind of an impression, I don't know if it's anything that you explicitly said in the book, I can't cite a page or anything, but one impression that I got after reading your book was that you don't see parenting as particularly, I'm not going to say important, but let's say particularly decisive in outcomes for children. And one worry that I have around that is that someone could read this and think that them doing a good job as a parent doesn't lead to their kid's success, because at a population level, it doesn't predict an individual kid's success. But I wonder if this could be and maybe I'm wrong here, maybe this is truly just a misunderstanding, but could it be that all or most parents are trying really hard to do a good job parenting, right? They're like, most parents are pushing their kids, trying to make their kids, fully functioning, successful members of society. And so everyone is in the treatment group. And so not a lot of variance is predicted, right? So like, again, this could come from a misunderstanding on my part, but to me, it's almost like if we gave everyone in the population or almost everyone in the population anabolic steroids and then did a study, right? And concluded that anabolic steroids don't increase muscle mass because they weren't predicting variance in muscle mass in the population. So could it be that like you almost can't, even though parenting isn't predicting variance in the population, you still have to be a bit of a aggressive parent. I don't know if aggressive is the right word, but like pushing your kid because that's what everyone's doing. And the reason variance is low is because everyone's getting that treatment.
Right. Well, first of all, in anabolic steroids, it's a good point in a way that you could give everybody the same dose or even moderate the dose based on their body weight or other factors. People are going to respond differently. That's what this whole area of pharmacogenomics is about. Individual differences, genetically driven individual differences in response to any drug you want to mention. And so that's an important direction for medical research. But it makes the point, though, contrary to what you were saying, that there'd be huge individual differences and it would be highly heritable.
Oh, no, I'm not saying that it wouldn't be heritable. I'm saying, sorry, I must have phrased that poorly. What I'm saying is that if you gave everyone in the population the same dose of steroids and then and again, this could be just a statistical misunderstanding, but then did like twin and adoption studies, you'd say, well, steroids aren't really predicting much variance here. It's genetics because we're seeing that there's genetic differences in responses to steroids, if that makes sense. And in the same way, there's genetic differences in responses to parenting, but parenting is still what's causing the not increase in muscle mass, but increase in success and things like that.
First of all, if you gave everyone the same dose of anabolic steroids, you can't correlate it because there's no variability, right? All you could correlate is some sort of response to anabolic steroids.
Right.
And that, what I'm saying is, that response to anabolic steroids and the way that response to steroids affects outcomes that you're interested in, like athletics or something like that, that would show genetic influence and there would be individual differences. So I don't know if that example's so good, but when it is applied to parenting, it's definitely not good because I have a feeling you grew up in a very lovely environment, parental environment, but I'm sure you know that good parenting like that is not universal. And there's a lot of abuse. And, when I study 10,000 families in Britain, and, it's even on videotaping parents, what they will do, even on a video with their kids. I mean, they're just horrible to the kids.
So your response is that the variance in parenting effort is much higher than I'm assuming.
Yeah. And I'm saying, though, it doesn't make a lot of difference.
Okay.
And so here's the thing is, I get a letter every couple months from, say, a parent who, especially adoptive parents who, adopt a kid because they assume that all you need is tender, loving care and everything's going to be fine. But in adolescence, the kid starts to go off the rails and gets into drugs, maybe ends up, in trouble with the law. And the parents are wondering, what did I do wrong? Because I did everything I could. I gave the kid all the love and support and everything I could. And they turned out bad. And you say it's actually the problem that parents who rear their own kids have, but it's just exacerbated with adoptive parents because their kids are genetically unrelated to them. But it's the same sort of thing that the best parents can have kids, who become schizophrenic because whether the 1% of the population who gets diagnosed as schizophrenic, it's just a very serious mental illness where you lose touch with reality, that 1%, it's not related to anything the parents do. And so imagine, you're a parent who has done everything, your kid's doing well in secondary school, and then suddenly, in their teens, late teens, they start getting more and more isolated and then start showing schizophrenic symptoms of hallucinations, and delusions. And, if you believe that you're responsible for the way your kid turns out, it's heartbreaking to see parents beating themselves up. What did I do wrong to make my kid schizophrenic? And you didn't do anything wrong to make your kid schizophrenic. It's DNA that's the major systematic force. There might be environmental factors, like Kurt Vonnegut's son had his first acute psychotic, schizophrenic episode after a long amphetamine drug thing, which is commonly known to cause paranoia and that sort of thing. And probably if you have that genetic vulnerability, it's more likely to trigger it than his friends, who didn't have that. So I do, I know it's hard to believe that parents have as little effect as I say, but what you're talking about in a way is like a factory model. Parents are doing what they need to do to produce good little citizens. And
Yes.
I don't think they do much, actually. And,
Got it.
But what's important is Judith Rich Harris, who wrote this wonderful book in the 1990s, who's now died a few years ago, called The Nurture Assumption. She talks about this well, and she says parents might not affect the children's long-term outcome, but they're critically important in terms of day-to-day enjoyment and enjoyment of the relationship. I often say, if you chose a spouse and you said, okay, I'm going to marry this woman, she's okay basically, but I'm sure I can shape her up. And, I do things to make her learn to play the piano because I think a civilized person ought to learn to be able to read music. That would be a recipe for disaster, wouldn't it? Because you do things for people because you love them, not because you're trying to make them into something you want them to be. So with your kids too. Yeah, you do all you can for them. You want life to be nice for them, including, not letting them do what they want to do. You say, well, if you do that, you're going to be making life miserable for yourself. If you hang out with those kids, if you do too much drugs, that sort of thing. So it's not like you say, oh, well, I don't have to do anything. To the contrary, you want to make the relationship nice, but you're doing it because you love them, not because you're trying to make them be something you want them to be. I think it's a really important distinction. And the Tiger Mom thing can definitely be counterproductive, as it was with me and my sons in piano lessons, for example. Yeah, so I think there's quite strong messages here for parenting, and especially in contrast to the fact if you go into a bookshop and you'll see rows and rows of books about parenting. Someone told me there's 10,000 books that have been published on parenting, and they all give this very dogmatic advice. And there's only 2 books that even mention genetics. Yet I think genetics is the single most important factor that people need to know about being a parent.
The spouse example or spouse analogy you gave really kind of knocked down all the dominoes in my head there. You're right. It would seem not only completely misled to pick a spouse and then try to upgrade them, although I'm sure many people do that, but it would also seem to come from a place that's really not loving in the way that most of us would want to be. Yeah, I mean, it would be not only a really fallible mission, but one that would seem, in some sense, morally bad.
Right.
And I guess if we view our children the same way, where it's like you want to let them become who they are, as you argue, then it starts to seem like forcing a child to go to basketball camp when they hate sports is actually just kind of needless. Not only not likely to be successful, but really assured to be unpleasant in terms of a parent-child interaction. Wow. Yeah, I really like that analogy. That's going to stick with me.
I think that is the point. It's counterproductive to the relationship. And in the end, it's the relationship that's important. That's what gets you through the bad times. So, yeah, so I do think there's important messages for parenting. I was going to follow up my book, Blueprint, with a book on genetics and parenting, and I got a contract for it, but then after 9 months or so, I just really couldn't do it because I thought Blueprint was as low as I could go. I mean, I was, not being condescending, but just saying I tried to explain things at the simplest level I could, but most people tell me it's not a simple book. There's some of these issues that you're raising, for example. But with parenting, you cannot write a parenting book unless you're really down and dirty, with talking about your kid's poo. And, so I just, can't. I decided it wasn't fun. I couldn't do it. But I hope somebody does do it because that's a real wide open goal,
You mentioned psychiatric disorders, and we've kind of skirted around these. And this is, for whatever reason, this is like the least controversial area of behavior genetics when you speak to people in the lay public. Like if you say that schizophrenia is highly heritable, nobody bats an eyelid. It's really things like obesity and divorce where people start to really get on their hind legs and want to fight you about it. But
the biggest one of all, of course, being intelligence and cognitive ability.
right, which we haven't talked about at all,
No,
and now that third rail has been just reached out and grabbed. But yeah. So we see, and the reverse of that, funnily enough, actually, this segues perfectly. It's just that with cognitive disabilities, no one has any issue with the idea that genetics are playing a role. I have no idea why this is.
Yeah, exactly right.
But with
I'm puzzled by that too. Like I study school achievement, and so reading ability is a big part of that. And people get upset about that for some reason when you talk about the normal range of reading ability, and yet you talk about reading disability, and everyone says, "Oh yeah, right, of course. You ought to be studying that." So it's a very peculiar thing, isn't it? Or with intelligence as a whole, nobody has trouble saying that we ought to understand severe intellectual disability. But
yeah,
it's a funny thing. I think it goes back to this black and white issue of disorders, where back to Mendel, you either have it or you don't. It's kind of like people want it in that simplistic categorical way. And it is hard to understand variance, I think, the normal distribution.
we should definitely talk about the idea of psychiatric disorders and psychological disorders as spectrums rather than binaries.
Yep.
But and we'll definitely get to that shortly. But I'll use a personal example just so it's like as uninflammatory as possible. I have ADHD. My sister has ADHD. My mother has ADHD. There's probably tons of undiagnosed ADHD in my family. And nobody has an issue with me coming on this podcast and saying, okay, ADHD runs in my family and that's genetic. But on the other hand, let's say that everyone in my family is also has very high verbal intelligence, right? Like that, I don't think there's a bad speaker in my family, period. But if I were to say, yeah, being a good speaker runs in my family, right? People would react as if I had said something insane and hurtful, right? Like the idea that a person's verbal ability, a person's verbal capability specifically, is partially determined by their genes. For whatever reason, that is arsenic. That is poison. And I do wonder, because obviously, as soon as you accept that disability is genetic, you've already opened up the spectrum of variance being partially genetic, right? Like once you've acknowledged the lower end of the curve, which is going to be disabilities, you've already opened up that there is a curve which has variance partially explained by genetics. So I actually don't see the problem myself, but I'm clearly missing something.
Yeah.
Because I know that even saying this, I'm going to get, as soon as I hit publish on this podcast, I'm going to get messages on social media kind of explaining why this is upsetting.
Yeah. And what I think it's about is that people don't, you say, well, if you got the disability, there's obviously the rest of the distribution, the spectrum. But I don't think people go there. They're still thinking dichotomously. Either you have it or you don't. And that's aided by the medicalization of these problems. They're not disorders. I have a paper that's called "There Are No Common Disorders, Only Dimensions." This is like from 10 years ago or so. And I didn't get much pushback on that because, psychiatrists who work with patients know this is true. But medicalization makes it look like there's an ideologically distinct disorder. Like your kid has trouble learning to read at school. That's a problem. But why is it helped by having a doctor say your child has dyslexia? The medicalization comes in by giving it a Greek or Latin name. ADHD used to be hyperkinesia. And even now I say you don't have ADHD. There are two components to it. It's an attentional component and an activity component, to ADHD diagnoses. And there's dimensions there. And some people are high in activity and some people are low in attention. And I think if there was the label when I was growing up, ADHD, there wasn't, I definitely would have been labeled ADHD. Because in those days, we were forced to sit in chairs for hours at an end. They were actually like all linked up with one another in a row. And it drove me absolutely bonkers. Plus, I was bored to death by what they were doing. So, I definitely would have been called a hyperactive kid. But actually, I think this is a bit like the old personality story in divorce. Those things that were bad at school, when I was in the structured environment of the school, I think are part of my success as an adult. Because the activity was more like energy level. And I have a sense in your family, that's what it is too. It isn't just like, you tap your foot and, you have spillover of fidgety sort of energy, but, you've got zest and energy for doing things. You throw yourselves into stuff. And I think what we call low attention span, I don't even buy that, that it's necessarily a problem. It has to do with the fact that if I'm bored with something, yeah, I lose, I'm not, my attention span isn't very good. But boy, when I'm into something, I can really tunnel into it, and lose myself in it.
You might assume in 99% of cases that I have a short attention span because, I can't sit down to watch a movie in its entirety. I can't remember the last movie I finished. And, I'll be basically jumping from topic to topic in a conversation. I'm very easily bored with most things. But then if you were to see me doing something I enjoy, like working on this podcast, if you were to film me, you'd watch me work for 10 hours straight without any signs of boredom.
And when you're in a highly structured environment in school where someone's telling you all the time what you have to do minute by minute, that doesn't work very well. But when you get out in life and you're an adult, you create your own environment. You do what you want to do. And social media and the internet has been especially good for that. Podcasts, you really can do what you're good at. And I think it's so important for people to kind of recognize what they like to do and what they're good at. You think that's obvious, but I think a lot of people, just kind of get sucked along in life and they never stop and say, well, wait a minute now, this isn't my skill set. This isn't my interest set, So it's just lovely when people find the match like you and podcasts, for example. It's a good example, really, that it capitalizes on things that people might have said were weaknesses, but they're not when they're applied to things you like to do, and you can determine what you like to do. You don't have someone telling you what you have to do.
And what's interesting about that is that's kind of a self-compassion version of the parenting advice that you gave of like letting your kid become who they are. And in the very easy to accept example, letting your spouse be who they are, obviously, but then also letting yourself be who you are.
That's exactly right. Yeah. And then I also say that it's not just about parenting, just as you're saying now. I think genetics gives you a view of tolerance of others, but then tolerance of yourself as well. Like if you're shy in America, I'm kind of struck at one difference between English and Americans is this, what we call shyness. Everyone in England has a story about they were on a plane with an American and they started telling them about everything about their life, their childhood, their sex life, everything, whereas in England that's considered, weird. But then probably the American looks at this person, oh, they're really shy and introverted. They don't really open up at all. But, it's a matter of context. And if you are shy, like I am actually shy in the sense that I don't like, if people say, oh, there's cocktail parties, a lot of people to meet you don't know. That for me has no interest, and in a way, in America, that's considered pathological. But as you get older, you just say, well, that's what I like and I don't like. And I don't have to do what I don't like to do. I don't have to go to a cocktail party if I don't want to. And I know I can do it. I can put on a show and I can make myself do it. And I also know that it's not much related to sociability and relationships. The shyest person can have very close, loving relationships with some people. It's just they don't do well in initial encounters with strangers. They find it anxiety producing and, they just don't like it. They don't enjoy it. So I think, the best example I love of this is B.F. Skinner. Do you know who I mean? He was this famous
the behaviorist.
Behaviorist, yeah. And to the extreme of raising his daughter in a cage because he wanted to have complete control over the environmental inputs. and his daughter was rather screwed up at the end of it. But in his old age, he wrote a book on aging, and in there he has this great quote, "This is the ultimate environmentalist, behaviorist. Everything that you are has to do with these environmental stimuli that you receive." Yet later in life he wrote, "The older I become, the more I become who I am." It's like accepting that you just learn more and more what you like and what you're good at, and you become more accepting of it. You say, well, that's the way I am. It doesn't mean you can't change yourself. It's not deterministic, but it's this business about going against the grain. Why do that? Why swim upstream? Why not go with the flow? And part of that flow is your genetic propensities.
Yeah, your life doesn't have to be this never-ending quest of, changing yourself, if that makes sense. I've only got a few more questions. I hope that's all right.
Sure.
Okay, good. Just checking. You've been wonderful, by the way. This has
That's
been
great
a
talking
fantastic
to you.
interview.
You're
Yeah,
really
no, it's
hitting
been
exactly the right questions. It's quite amazing. Yeah.
Okay, good. So I guess we've spoken about disorders quite a bit now, and I wouldn't say as light a word as hinted at, but we've certainly talked about the fact that disorders are spectrums for the most part, with the exception of some that are just caused by single genes. It's many hundreds or certainly many genes having small effects on your propensity for disorder. And from this, you conclude that the diagnostic manuals, while they might be useful for insurance purposes or something like that, or whether you can get a prescription, they don't necessarily map onto reality in a super coherent way. And in psychological circles, you say that this point hasn't been met with that much controversy. But I do wonder, though, because just as someone kind of going about their day, as someone who's not a clinical psychologist or anything like that, it does seem like there are people who have things that are different. Like I think about schizophrenia, which you say is a spectrum. It's like, yes, you could have a higher or a lower polygenic score for schizophrenia. Yes, you could have more or less paranoia about your social interactions. But with some things, it's like, well, you either hear a voice in your head that's not there, or you don't hear that voice, right? You're either having hallucinations or you're not. Your reality testing is either intact or it's not. And so a lot of symptoms, even if there's a spectrum genetically, a lot of symptoms manifest in this binary way. So what's the alternative practically for a psychologist or a psychiatrist to our current way of doing things? Like someone comes into the office and they're like, "Hey, I'm hallucinating." It's like, what shouldn't we have words that label that as being different from what everyone else is experiencing?
No, I don't agree at all. That I don't think these are binary symptoms. Children, for example, hallucinate and they have delusions all the time. So that's not an issue with children. But as you get older, actually, we differ a lot in the extent to which we're, say, daydreaming. So I think most psychiatrists would say even the symptoms are not in themselves binary.
Wow.
It's not that the thought disorganization that occurs with schizophrenia, it's a gradual process. You don't just wake up one day with this complete loss of touch with reality. So I don't think that is the case at all. And you certainly see it with like major depression. That's really very far out there, where we're not talking about having the blues. We're talking about not being able to function, not being able to get out of bed, not eating, not sleeping. It's really very terrible, but it's quantitative, the extent to which these symptoms occur and the extent to which they interfere with your life. So I think even at a symptomatic level, they're not. The example people use particularly of falling off a cliff is like heart attacks. They say, well, either you have a heart attack or you don't. But it's not true. We're all having little heart attacks. We just don't measure them. They don't have that big an effect. Strokes, we have strokes all the time. And you can see those in MRI. It's a question of how big they are, where they are in the brain. So even these things that you think of as completely binary, having a stroke or having a heart attack, they're really not. They're quantitative. But more importantly, So there is this a chapter in my book called "The Abnormal is Normal." That is, there are no common disorders. There are only quantitative traits. And that's because we're dealing, as you said, with these polygenic characteristics influenced by many genes, because single gene disorders are qualitative. They are etiologically distinct. And the medical model leads us to think that way. Like with COVID, it's very important to diagnose COVID correctly. That's why these diagnostic tests were so important, because what causes COVID is the SARS-2 virus. It's a single cause of COVID. Now we know, there's different types of viruses and that sort of thing, but, basically you get COVID if you got SARS, and it's necessary and sufficient. And that's like a single gene sort of thing too, It's hardwired, and the medical model pushes us that way. And that's why I think people don't really realize that there is always a spectrum, for example. But from a genetic point of view, it's psychiatry that's the worst off here, because no psychiatric disorder has been created on the basis of evidence. They're all historical. Like with ASD, autistic spectrum disorder. That was Kanner in 1945 who said there are these kids who are really screwed up and they have problems with communication and repetitive behavior problems, like needing, compulsiveness, needing their slippers lined up just exactly so before they go to bed and they can go to sleep. And then you say, but okay, kids who have any of these problems, that's not good. And if they have several of those problems, that's worse. But what makes you say that this is a syndrome? And there's no evidence. It's just because Kanner said so in 1945, and it's been written into diagnostic manuals ever since. And there are kids who have all three of those problems, and they're worse off than kids who have two problems. But that doesn't mean they're related. Genetic studies show there's almost no relationship between these components of autistic spectrum disorder. They're genetically unrelated.
Wow.
So we're putting things together that are completely different. The bigger problem for psychiatry is when you're diagnosing patients who are really off the wall, the first distinction you make is between bipolar affective disorders, where you go from mania to depression, versus schizophrenia, which is more like a thought disorder and isn't so much the matter of depression or mania. Well, so that's been in the psychiatry for 100 and some years. Everybody accepts that distinction. Well, when the first studies were done trying to find genes for schizophrenia, this is like 2009, they found some genes that were really predictive of schizophrenia in independent populations. Every one of those genes was also predicted bipolar, even though these are supposed to be completely different disorders. It turns out now that the genetic correlation between what we call bipolar and what we call schizophrenia is like 0.6. The same genes are affecting both of these things. So it's a mess. And, there's so much history here. It's just hard for people to understand that there's no relationship between what these psychiatric diagnoses and the genetic architecture. And genes aren't everything, but they are the most important systematic factor going on here. So this is really going to change. It's starting to change already. That there are people who are saying we've got to throw this all away and we've got to build something up empirically rather than historically.
Right. That's a terribly complicated mission that you've just laid out.
But how can you find cures for something that doesn't exist? Really, the only drugs that have been developed have been serendipitous, nothing has been designed for that. And so it's important to say that, I'm not saying these aren't problems. People have lots of problems, just like with reading problems. It's important to know that a kid is having trouble learning to read. But what's to be gained by calling it dyslexia? It makes the parents feel a little better. I hear this a lot. Well, now I know my kid has dyslexia, as if that answers anything. It doesn't do anything. In fact, it probably labels the kid in a way that's not correct because they don't have dyslexia. They have problems reading. Lots of kids have problems reading. And you want to do something about that. But I don't think anything's gained by this medicalization of calling it a disorder, dyslexia.
I mean, surely though, like if someone's having psychosis, I mean, whether or not we say that they're schizophrenic or that they're just experiencing a symptom known as psychosis, I mean, I guess the procedure of using I don't know what acceptance and commitment therapy combined with some kind of antipsychotic drug, that would still be more or less the same.
Not because they have schizophrenia, but because they have problems that are alleviated by these drugs or therapies. There's a lot of work with cognitive behavior therapy, even on schizophrenia, just to reduce
Yes.
the symptoms and to have schizophrenics function better. Not to cure schizophrenia, but just to say, look, you're at risk for getting paranoid very easily. And look, this is what happens. This situation occurs and you interpret it in this very negative way, and then it starts to prey on your mind, and you've got to stop yourself, snap your wrist with a rubber band sort of thing to say, wait a minute now, I see what's happening here. And even cognitive behavior therapy can work, but there's nothing to be gained by having these diagnostic disorders. And here's the hot new thing in psychiatry that kind of makes my point here. It's not just schizophrenia and bipolar that are genetic related. All psychiatric disorders are genetically related to one another. The same genes are affecting a lot of psychopathology. And that's known now as P, the general factor of psychopathology. And it accounts for a whole lot of variance in mental illness. And so this is what's happening now is people are saying, well, if the genetics just means that you're more likely to be diagnosed with some mental disorder, but it's not the mental disorder that you're diagnosed with that's a problem. It's this just general propensity towards psychopathology. The way it comes out isn't really important. And as a result of that, now people are looking for transdiagnostic therapies and drugs. Because if the genetics is transdiagnostic, what we should be looking for are therapies and drugs that work across a lot of these. And CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, is an example of that. It works across a lot of different, reducing symptoms, for a lot of disorders. So you can see where that could be really revolutionary. It goes just the opposite of our tendency to want to pigeonhole and categorize. This person doesn't have bipolar manic depressive, they're schizoaffective, which is like in between schizophrenia and bipolar. Or the other side of this is, you mentioned spectrum. Everyone talks about, well, everything's a spectrum now, autism especially, he's on the spectrum, right? But the spectrum idea is just to say, it's like to give another category. Yeah, there's the people who really have autism, and then there's the people who sort of do, and then there's us normal people. Well, none of us is normal. We all have thousands of genetic risk factors for schizophrenia. It's all quantitative. So you can see where that is really going to revolutionize psychiatry. And the most concrete thing right now is this P factor, the fact that it really is the opposite of these discrete categories. The biggest part of the genetics is just general to all disorders.
I mean, I guess that shouldn't really be surprising, right? Because the fact that intelligence is general doesn't really surprise people because, it's kind of a measure of how your cognitive processing functions. And you'd expect that, someone who's better at using cognitive processing in one domain would probably be better in other domains as well. And I guess on the flip side of that, it's like, yeah, if you have, a propensity towards psychological troubles in one area, right? If your psychology is unstable in one way, you'd expect that it would also be more likely to struggle in other places as well. I guess since we're just kind of on the button of what's next, something that a lot of people are going to be thinking about, especially with these, hot new technologies, or relatively new now, but certainly still hot technologies such as CRISPR and things like that, gene editing. What I don't actually see, and this might be just my intuition failing me, the story you've told today of everything being on a spectrum, genes having effects on multiple things at once, each thing being affected or caused by many genes in many cases, I don't really see an avenue towards this future that everyone seems to now presume is coming where, we're going to have designer babies and things like that. It almost seems too complex to possibly mess around in a way that works. But maybe you disagree. I don't know. What do you think?
I do agree. Gene editing, even if there's a single gene involved, like phenylketonuria is a single recessive gene, but it operates through the brain, and it's not like it has one pathway. So even with single gene disorders, there's only very few examples in which gene editing, like CRISPR, has been able to make a difference because we have trillions of cells. Now, if you could change genes in the cell that you begin life with, which combines half the chromosomes from your mother, half from your father, that same DNA is in all the cells of your body. So if you could change the gene there, well, then it would have an effect throughout your whole body. But if you think of something even like the ones that people have tried first, like cystic fibrosis, where the avenue in, it seems pretty straightforward, it's the lung. And so you could change genes in the lung to make up for that mutation that causes cystic fibrosis and all these lung sorts of problems. But it's been very difficult there, and the first trial actually had to be stopped because it ended up in a fatality quite a long time ago. But there's a lot of work along these lines, but it's not easy even if it's a single gene. But now imagine you've got 10,000 bits of DNA making a difference. How are you going to do that? I don't really see it. So never say never, and there's a lot of work being done here. This mRNA that was so responsible for the vaccines, that has a lot of potential for delivering drugs to cells, but that isn't the same as changing genes.
Yeah, I guess it makes things, because the whole issue of designer babies is kind of hard to think about ethically and how you would proceed. I'm almost not sure whether to be relieved that this future doesn't seem, at least not on the near horizon, or disappointed, because there would be something great about being able to, certainly with, I've got mental illness in my family, and I do think it would be wonderful if there was a way to prevent it in offspring using gene editing. But it's actually a bit of a thorny issue, and so it's kind of, there's something nice about thinking that maybe I don't even have to think about it. Yeah.
Okay, well, don't think about it.
Well, I want to thank you so much for spending the afternoon with me, but I also really want to thank you for writing this book, Blueprint. Not only do I think you did really a masterful job of making a very complex topic intelligible, as you have in this conversation as well, I also think you did an incredible job making a topic that many people would find emotionally upsetting very palatable. I found the book, very compassionate and also very entertaining. I thought it was quite funny at a few points. You've got some good one-liners in there. So I'm going to put a link to buy it in the show description. And since this show is getting published on Christmas Day, I'll just say that if any intellectually curious person wants to buy a Christmas present for themselves today, this would definitely be my recommendation. So
nice.
Thank you so much, Robert.
Nice.
Thank you
Super
for coming on.
talking to you, Macken.
Thanks again to Dr. Plomin for coming on the show. Again, you can buy his fantastic book, Blueprint, using the link in the show description, or just by Googling it or going to your local bookstore. Happy Christmas again to all who celebrate. If you're feeling generous in the Christmas spirit, you can go to macandmurphy.org and scroll down to the donate button near the species logo. That's the only way this show makes money, and I'm so grateful for your support, as always. I'll talk to you again soon. Happy holidays, and remember to be kind to animals.